She thought she had the situation under control. But when the unthinkable happened, everything changed. Isabelle was left stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no one to turn to, and the only person who could help her was the last person she wanted to ask. What happens next will change everything. The night they shared was just the beginning. Can forgiveness and trust rebuild what was broken? Watch the full story to find out how a single moment can transform a life. Now it's your turn. Backhand index pointing right, like, comment, and subscribe to follow Isabelle's journey on epic story moments. Backhand index pointing down, let us know your thoughts below. What would you do if you were in her shoes? Do you think empathy can change someone's heart, or is it too late to fix things? Movie cameras, stay tuned for more suspense-filled moments and emotional twists. You don't want to miss what happens next. The rain pours relentlessly over a bustling city, turning streets into reflective rivers of light. People rush under umbrellas, hailing cabs with urgency, their breath visible in the chilly air. Amid the chaos, a single yellow cab weaves through the traffic, its warm glow a beacon for stranded commuters. Emma, a middle-aged woman clad in an expensive trench coat, stands under a store awning, gripping her designer purse tightly. Her annoyance is palpable as she repeatedly checks her watch, muttering about the delay. She hails the cab with a sharp whistle, her sense of entitlement unmistakable. On the opposite side of the street, Marcus, a tall black man in casual yet neat attire, also waits for a ride. He looks calm despite the storm, his demeanor hinting at resilience. When the cab finally approaches, both raise their hands simultaneously, locking eyes briefly through the rain. Their silent interaction speaks volumes. Emma's sharp glance carries a subtle judgment, while Marcus's calm gaze betrays no reaction. The cab slows down, caught between their gestures, and the stage is set for an encounter that will challenge perspectives and reveal deeper truths about human nature. Emma Waters is the epitome of privilege. In her early 40s, she exudes an air of authority, her perfectly tailored beige trench coat and leather handbag serving as subtle declarations of her success. Her face, though framed by sharp cheekbones and immaculate makeup, carries an impatient expression, as if the world is always running a step behind her expectations. A marketing executive at a high-profile firm, Emma is used to getting what she wants when she wants it. Her life is a curated display of achievements, a luxury apartment in the city, an enviable circle of influential friends, and the habit of frequenting upscale cafes where her lattes are always made to her exact specifications. Beneath this polished exterior, however, lies a deeply ingrained prejudice, shaped by years of privilege and the subtle, unchallenged biases she's inherited and perpetuated. On this rainy evening, Emma's irritation is amplified by the weather. Her schedule is already delayed, and now, the struggle to find a cab adds to her frustration. As she waits, she mutters about the inefficiency of the city, her disdain bubbling to the surface when she spots Marcus across the street. Without even realizing it, her mind leaps to conclusions. His casual attire and damp umbrella somehow strike her as out of place, as though he doesn't belong in the same sphere as her. When the cab approaches, she feels an almost automatic entitlement to it. It's her cab, she tells herself, justified by nothing more than her sense of superiority. Little does Emma know, this moment will force her to confront the very prejudices she has long ignored. Marcus Bennett is a man defined by quiet strength and resilience. In his late 30s, he has the kind of warmth that puts people at ease, though his life has been far from easy. Standing across the street in the rain, he adjusts his weathered but clean jacket, shielding himself with a simple umbrella that has seen better days. Despite the chill in the air, Marcus wears a calm expression, his posture upright but unassuming. A middle school teacher, Marcus spends his days nurturing young minds in an underfunded school district. He believes in the power of education to change lives, a value instilled in him by his grandmother, who raised him with kindness and discipline. Marcus's life isn't glamorous. He lives modestly, budgeting every paycheck to ensure his students have supplies when the school can't provide them. Tonight, Marcus is heading home after volunteering at an after-school program. The rain-soaked streets delay his journey, but he doesn't complain. Instead, he observes the world around him with quiet empathy, from the frazzled mother juggling groceries to the cab driver maneuvering through the flooded roads. When the cab approaches, Marcus steps forward with a polite wave. He notices Emma on the other side of the street and instinctively pauses, considering whether she might need the ride more. Marcus's kindness, however, is often overlooked by strangers who see only his appearance. His humble demeanor masks the complexity of his experiences, moments of triumph overshadowed by challenges, instances of prejudice met with grace. As he and Emma lock eyes through the rain, Marcus senses the tension but says nothing. He's used to assumptions being made about him, but tonight, fate will demand more of him than quiet endurance. The rain intensifies, drumming against the pavement as the cab hesitates between Emma and Marcus. The air is thick with unspoken tension, their contrasting lives colliding in this fleeting moment. Emma's sharp glare reflects a simmering entitlement, while Marcus's calm gaze hides a lifetime of navigating assumptions. The cab driver glances nervously between the two, sensing the unspoken standoff. The scene brims with quiet conflict, a prelude to something far deeper than a battle for a ride. As the cab inches forward, the storm outside mirrors the brewing storm within, a confrontation that will challenge beliefs and leave neither unchanged. The city is alive with chaos, its usual rhythm disrupted by an unrelenting downpour. Streets glisten with water, reflecting the kaleidoscope of neon signs and headlights that illuminate the bustling scene. Pedestrians scurry under umbrellas, their hurried steps splashing through puddles as they navigate the crowded sidewalks. The symphony of honking horns, splashing tires, and muffled conversations fills the air, a cacophony both familiar and overwhelming. Cabs are a rare sight, their yellow beacons like elusive fireflies darting through the storm. Each one that appears is immediately swarmed by desperate commuters, their urgency evident in the aggressive waves and shouts competing for attention. Drivers glance cautiously at the chaos before deciding who to pick up, knowing that tonight, every passenger is a potential drama. On one side of the street stands Emma, shifting her weight impatiently and pulling her designer coat tighter against the rain. Her polished appearance contrasts sharply with the drenched and hurried crowd around her. Every so often, she mutters complaints about the inefficiency of public services, her irritation growing as cab after cab whizzes past, already occupied. Across the street, Marcus waits under the dim glow of a flickering streetlight. Unlike Emma, he seems at ease despite the miserable weather, watching the hurried crowd with a faint, knowing smile. He adjusts the handle of his umbrella, which struggles against the wind, and scans the street for a vacant cab. His calm demeanor sets him apart, a quiet presence amidst the urban storm. The scarcity of cabs creates a palpable tension, each unclaimed vehicle a beacon of hope in the tempest. When one finally approaches, both Emma and Marcus step forward at the same time, unknowingly setting the stage for an interaction that will change both their lives. Emma Waters lives a meticulously curated life. Her mornings start with a perfectly brewed latte in her high-rise apartment overlooking the city, where everything from the furniture to the art on the walls screams sophistication. As a senior marketing executive at a prestigious firm, Emma's days are packed with high-stakes meetings and networking events. She thrives in environments where she's in control, her sharp instincts and no-nonsense demeanor earning her respect and fear from her colleagues. Yet, Emma's confidence comes with an undercurrent of entitlement. She believes her success is entirely self-made, overlooking the privileges that paved her way. Born into an affluent family, Emma had access to private education, elite social circles, and career opportunities that she never questions. To her, merit and effort are all that matter, leaving little room to understand or empathize with struggles outside her experience. Beneath her polished exterior lies an unexamined bias, one that surfaces in subtle ways. Emma prides herself on being colorblind and often shares anecdotes about her diverse team at work. But in private, she avoids certain neighborhoods and locks her car doors at the sight of anyone who doesn't fit her image of success. On this rainy evening, Emma's frustrations bring her latent prejudices to the forefront. When she sees Marcus across the street, she doesn't consciously think of him as a threat, yet a flicker of judgment crosses her mind. His damp jacket, scuffed shoes, and calm demeanor feel out of place to her in a way she can't articulate. As the cab nears, Emma assumes it's hers without hesitation. After all, she's a paying professional with somewhere important to be. Marcus, in her eyes, becomes an inconvenience rather than an equal. Little does Emma realize that this fleeting assumption, born of years of privilege, will lead her into a situation where she'll be forced to confront the truth about herself. Marcus Bennett's life has been a testament to perseverance. Born and raised in a working-class neighborhood, he grew up with limited resources but an abundance of love. His grandmother, a pillar of strength, raised him after his parents' untimely deaths. She taught him the values of humility, hard work, and kindness, often saying, "No matter how the world treats you, you decide who you are." Despite the odds, Marcus excelled academically. He knew education was his way out of the cycle of struggle, and he worked tirelessly to secure scholarships and opportunities. He faced challenges others might never understand: the stares in classrooms where he was one of the few black students, the lowered expectations from some teachers, and the unspoken assumption that he didn't belong. Yet, Marcus met each obstacle with quiet determination, proving his worth through actions rather than words. Today, Marcus is a middle school teacher deeply committed to shaping young minds. He finds purpose in mentoring kids from underprivileged backgrounds, offering them the support he once needed. His classroom is a space of encouragement and fairness, where every child feels seen and heard. Marcus isn't wealthy by any means. His modest salary barely covers his expenses. Yet, he spends his own money on supplies for students who can't afford them, believing that even small gestures can make a difference. Marcus's values are rooted in empathy and resilience. He understands the importance of kindness, especially in a world that often lacks it. Though he's faced countless microaggressions and outright prejudices, he chooses not to carry bitterness. Instead, he channels his energy into creating a better future for those around him. On this rainy evening, Marcus is heading home after volunteering at an after-school program. When he spots Emma across the street, he notices her sharp, impatient gestures. It's a dynamic he's seen before, someone who sees only the surface and assumes the worst. Despite this, Marcus remains calm, ready to step back and let her take the cab if needed. His instinct to put others first, however, will soon be tested in ways he never expected. The rain falls harder as the cab approaches, its headlights cutting through the misty gloom. Both Marcus and Emma step forward, almost simultaneously, each intent on claiming the ride. The cab driver slows, his tired eyes darting between the two figures on opposite sides of the street, silently assessing who might flag him down first. Emma raises her hand high, her designer umbrella tilted just enough to shield her from the downpour while allowing her face to remain visible. Her sharp, purposeful movements convey a clear message. She expects to be picked up without question. Her heels click against the wet pavement as she moves closer to the curb, her irritation evident. Marcus, on the other side, glances briefly at Emma and steps back slightly. His instinct is to let her go first, an ingrained habit of politeness and avoiding conflict. But tonight is different. Marcus has spent hours volunteering at a youth center, and the thought of walking another 20 minutes in the pouring rain after an exhausting day makes him pause. He raises his hand, albeit hesitantly, signaling the cab driver. The cab halts between them, its windshield wipers slicing through the rain. Emma notices Marcus out of the corner of her eye and stiffens. Her gaze sharpens, her lips pressing into a thin line. In her mind, the situation is clear. She was here first, she signaled first, and she shouldn't have to argue for what's rightfully hers. The driver rolls down the window, his voice muffled by the rain. "Where you headed?" he asks, glancing between the two passengers. Before Marcus can respond, Emma interjects. "Downtown," she says curtly, her tone making it clear that she expects no further discussion. The driver hesitates, looking at Marcus, who calmly explains, "Same direction." Emma's expression hardens. She turns toward Marcus, her frustration barely concealed. "I think I signaled first," she says, her tone clipped but laced with an underlying edge of entitlement. Marcus remains calm, meeting her gaze with quiet composure. "Looks like we're headed the same way. We could share." Emma recoils slightly, her eyebrows raising in disbelief. "Sure?" The very idea feels uncomfortable, intrusive even. She glances at Marcus again, this time noticing the wear on his clothes and the casual umbrella that's barely holding together. Her internalized bias whispers in her ear, casting him as someone unworthy of her space. "No, thank you," she replies firmly, shaking her head. "I'd prefer to ride alone." Marcus doesn't argue. He steps back, offering a polite nod to the driver. "It's fine. You can take her," he says, his voice steady. The cab driver hesitates, sensing the tension, but ultimately unlocks the doors for Emma. She climbs in without another glance at Marcus, shutting the door behind her with a finality that echoes her decision. As the cab pulls away, Marcus remains on the sidewalk, his calm expression masking the sting of yet another moment where his humanity was diminished by someone else's assumptions. Inside the cab, Emma adjusts herself in the plush seat, annoyed by the lingering dampness from the rain outside. She barely spares a glance as Marcus stands under his flimsy umbrella, the rain soaking his shoulders. To her, the situation has been resolved. She got the cab as she deserved. The cab driver's voice interrupts her thoughts. "You sure you don't want to share? It's pouring out there and he's heading the same way." Emma's lips tighten as she turns to the driver. "I said no. I don't know him, and I'm not comfortable with that." Her words are firm, but her tone carries a thinly veiled judgment. She leans back into the seat, clutching her designer bag closer to her. The driver hesitates, glancing back at Marcus, who remains rooted on the sidewalk, his expression unreadable. "You know," the driver ventures cautiously, "it's not easy to get a cab in this weather. He seems like a decent guy." Emma sighs dramatically, her patience waning. "I don't pay to be lectured," she snaps. "If he needs a cab, he can wait for the next one. I'm not obligated to share my ride." The words hang in the air, sharp and dismissive. Marcus hears every syllable, but he doesn't react outwardly. He adjusts his umbrella, the rain dripping steadily from its edges, and steps further back, creating distance between himself and the cab. Inside, Emma continues her quiet tirade, speaking more to herself than to the driver. "Honestly, people don't respect boundaries anymore. If I wanted to ride with a stranger, I'd take the bus." Her gaze flickers to the driver's reflection in the rearview mirror, daring him to disagree. The driver shrugs, his expression neutral, but there's a flicker of disappointment in his eyes. "All right, lady, it's your ride," he says finally, putting the car into gear. As the cab begins to pull away, Emma allows herself a brief glance at Marcus through the rain-streaked window. For a moment, she feels a twinge of discomfort, not guilt, but a vague awareness that she might have been harsh. She quickly pushes the thought aside, justifying her actions to herself. "It's not about race or anything like that," she thinks. "I just don't want to share my space. That's all." Meanwhile, Marcus watches the cab disappear into the distance. His umbrella shifts slightly in his hand as the rain continues to pour. His shoulders, though still upright, carry the invisible weight of the moment, a familiar sting of being dismissed, judged, and diminished. Back in the cab, Emma pulls out her phone, distracted by messages and emails. The incident is already slipping from her mind, a fleeting annoyance in her otherwise controlled day. She doesn't realize that the very cab she refused to share might soon become the thread that ties her fate to Marcus in a way she never anticipated. The bustling city streets are alive with the sounds of traffic and people rushing home. As the woman and the man reach a taxi, she quickly moves to open the door, but when she notices him approaching from the opposite side, she halts, eyeing him with disdain. Without missing a beat, she scoffs, claiming that the cab is only for people like her and refuses to share it with him. Her words, heavy with judgment and entitlement, cut through the air, but the man remains unruffled. Instead of engaging in a verbal exchange or displaying anger, he simply looks at her, his expression calm and neutral. Without any sign of discomfort or frustration, he steps back and begins to walk away. His silence, in stark contrast to her confrontational stance, speaks volumes. The woman, anticipating some kind of response, watches him for a moment, but he says nothing, his movements deliberate as he distantly fades from the scene. Her initial shock gives way to irritation, but as she mutters under her breath, she realizes that the power in this exchange no longer belongs to her. The man's choice not to react leaves her in an uncomfortable silence, unable to control the situation as she'd expected. As he walks further away, she briefly wonders if she's overstepped, but quickly brushes the thought aside, focusing instead on her own righteous indignation. This moment marks a subtle but crucial shift in the power dynamics between them. The woman, so certain of her superiority moments ago, is now left alone, her harsh words hanging in the air, unanswered. The man's quiet rejection of conflict serves as the foundation for what's to come, foreshadowing that his path will not be dictated by aggression or defensiveness, but by a quiet strength and self-respect. In that moment, the man unknowingly sets in motion a journey that will force the woman to confront her own biases, all while challenging the assumptions that have long shaped her worldview. Though she may think nothing of this brief encounter now, the seed of change has been planted, and its full impact will unravel in unexpected ways as the woman settles into the back of the taxi, her mind still simmering from the earlier encounter. She leans back, trying to shake off the lingering irritation. The cab drives smoothly through the city streets, but as they approach the outskirts, the atmosphere begins to shift. The vibrant hum of the city fades, replaced by the quiet stillness of the less populated area. The buildings become sparse, the roads more worn, and the streetlights flicker in the evening air. The driver's casual conversation abruptly stops when the car stutters and then slows to a crawl. The woman's eyes narrow, sensing something is wrong. The cab lurches once more before the engine dies entirely, the car jerking to a stop on the side of the road. The driver mutters under his breath, slapping the steering wheel in frustration as the woman shifts uneasily in her seat. "Great," she mutters, her tone a mix of disbelief and annoyance. She taps her fingers on the armrest impatiently as the driver attempts to restart the engine, but the car remains stubbornly still. The faint light from nearby street lamps barely illuminates the desolate area around them, and the isolation of the place begins to settle in. The woman's irritation gives way to unease. She glances out the window, seeing nothing but empty, dimly lit streets and vacant storefronts. The driver tries to restart the engine several more times with no success, his attempts growing more desperate. "I'll have to call for a tow," he says, his voice tinged with frustration. He pulls out his phone, but his expression quickly sours. "No signal," he mutters, scrolling through his screen in vain. The woman's stomach drops. "How long is this going to take?" she demands, her voice now rising with panic. Her mind races with all the worst-case scenarios. She looks out at the abandoned streets again, and it hits her. She's completely alone, miles away from the city's safety and conveniences. This isn't just a random inconvenience, it's a serious problem. She's stranded in a place she doesn't recognize, far from help, with no way to get back to the city. The driver steps out of the car to check the engine, but the woman remains in the back seat, her anxiety increasing with each passing second. She twists her phone in her hands, but there's no signal, just the spinning icon of a disconnected call. Every attempt to contact someone, whether a friend or an emergency number, ends in failure. She rolls down the window and leans out, hoping for some sign of life. A car, a pedestrian, anything, but the street remains empty. Her heart begins to race. She curses under her breath, realizing that her earlier decision to dismiss the man in the taxi wasn't just an act of arrogance. It was a mistake, one she now regrets. As the minutes tick by, the air grows colder, and the stark reality of her situation sets in. The isolation and vulnerability she's feeling now are a far cry from the confidence she had just moments ago, back when she was sure she could handle anything on her own. She reaches for her phone again, hoping for a miracle, but the screen remains unresponsive. The woman is trapped in the middle of nowhere, with no way out, until, perhaps, the man she had so callously dismissed earlier comes back into the picture. As the minutes drag on, the woman grows more agitated, her sense of control slipping away with every failed attempt to reach out. The cold air seeps through the cracked window, adding to her growing unease. Her thoughts race, filled with the realization that her earlier arrogance has left her with no options. She curses softly under her breath, the sound swallowed by the silence around her. Suddenly, she hears a distant noise, a soft crunch of gravel underfoot, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Her head jerks toward the rearview mirror, but there's nothing there. Just the emptiness of the road stretching out behind her, swallowed by the darkening night. For a moment, she wonders if her mind is playing tricks on her, but the noise continues, growing nearer, then fading again. She sits up straighter, her pulse quickening. She turns her head, eyes scanning the dim street, but still, she sees nothing. The driver is still outside, focused on the engine, oblivious to the subtle shift in the air. But the woman's instincts tell her that she's not alone. Her gaze flicks toward the end of the street, where the shadows grow thicker, the distance too vast to see clearly. Then, just as she begins to doubt herself, a shape appears at the edge of her vision, familiar, yet unexpected. The figure is tall, walking with deliberate steps, moving steadily in her direction. Her heart skips a beat. For the briefest moment, she doesn't want to believe it. She doesn't want to admit that it could be him. But the thought lingers, the quiet tension building in the space between her and the approaching figure. The man's calm departure from the earlier confrontation plays over in her mind. Could he really be coming back? And if so, why? The woman's frustration escalates with every passing minute. The quiet hum of the city feels like a distant memory now, replaced by the eerie silence of the deserted street. Her mind races as she checks her phone again, but the screen still displays nothing. No signal, no connection, just a spinning wheel that mocks her growing panic. She feels isolated in a way she never expected. A confident, self-assured woman in the heart of the city is now a woman stranded in a forgotten corner, her security net fraying with each tick of the clock. She glances around once more, desperate for any sign of life, any movement that could promise her escape. The street is empty. The storefronts are dark and abandoned. There's no one walking by, no cars passing, nothing but the occasional flicker of a distant street lamp. She exhales sharply, trying to calm herself, but the unease lingers, tightening like a vice around her chest. Come on, she mutters under her breath as she tries the driver's phone once more. The desperation in her voice surprises her, but it's the only thing she can control. The driver, still outside the car, seems oblivious to her rising tension, his back turned as he continues to examine the engine. He mutters to himself, perhaps hoping for a miracle, but he hasn't offered any reassurances. Her eyes dart to the rearview mirror, hoping for some sign of movement, anything that could indicate help on the way. Still, there's nothing. Her anxiety mounts as the realization hits. She's alone, completely alone, with no one around to offer assistance. She's become a small figure in a vast, silent world, her independence turning into isolation in the blink of an eye. After a few more moments of staring at the dark, empty road, she pulls the door open, the cold night air hitting her face with a sharp sting. The chill only heightens her awareness of her vulnerability. She steps out of the cab, glancing at the driver who is still working on the engine, completely unaware of her growing distress. She hesitates, glancing up and down the road once again. She makes a snap decision to walk, even though she has no idea where she's going. It's better than sitting here, waiting helplessly. Her heels click against the pavement as she begins to walk, a small sense of purpose returning with each step. But the further she goes, the more the street seems to swallow her whole. The lights grow dimmer, the buildings more distant. She reaches a corner, her heart hammering in her chest, and looks around, but still no sign of life. Her confidence, once so certain, now feels like a fragile memory. She pulls her coat tighter around her, trying to ward off the biting cold, and presses on, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. She can't believe how quickly everything has turned. She had been so sure of herself earlier, dismissing the man without a second thought. Now, every shadow seems to hold the possibility of danger, every movement in her peripheral vision sends her pulse spiking. She turns a corner, and for a brief moment, she thinks she sees something, a figure in the distance, moving toward her. But as she takes a step forward, the figure disappears into the darkness, and the street remains empty once again. Her nerves are frayed, and she can feel her composure slipping with each passing moment. The woman hurries back to the taxi, her earlier resolve faltering. She peeks around the corner, scanning for any sign of another person. There's nothing. She turns back toward the car, only to find the driver still outside, his efforts unsuccessful. Her frustration bubbles over, her fear now tinged with anger. "Why aren't you helping me?" she snaps, her voice sharp. The driver looks up, startled by her outburst. "I'm doing everything I can," he responds, though his tone is tinged with guilt. "There's nothing I can do without a tow." The woman rubs her temples, feeling the tension in her head building. She's aware now of just how alone she is. She's come to rely on her own strength and wit, but this moment, this isolation, tests her in ways she hasn't faced before. The vulnerability she feels is raw and uncomfortable, and it's hard for her to admit how much she hates it. She walks a few steps away from the taxi, her mind a whirlwind. The night feels like it's closing in on her, and she's trapped, forced to reckon with the fact that her usual tactics of control and self-reliance have failed her. She checks her phone again, the hopelessness sinking deeper into her chest. There's nothing left to do but wait. But as she stands there, still unable to fully accept her helplessness, she hears something. It's a sound she can't place at first, a faint shuffle, followed by the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on gravel. She freezes, her heart pounding. She looks over her shoulder, and her breath catches in her throat. There, at the end of the street, is the figure of a man. The same man. The one from earlier. For a moment, she thinks she might be imagining it. Could it really be him, walking toward her in the desolate silence of the street? Her pulse quickens, a mixture of dread and something else, something she can't name. She waits, holding her breath, as he steps closer, his presence unmistakable now. The vulnerability she has felt all along seems to swell in her chest. Her earlier dismissal of him, her attempt to assert control over the situation, now feels foolish. She stands still, her body tense, watching as the man's silhouette sharpens in the dim light. What does this encounter mean? And more importantly, what will she do now that he's reappeared in her world when she needs help most? The woman stands frozen on the cracked sidewalk, her eyes locked onto the figure emerging from the darkness at the end of the street. Her heart races as the man draws closer, his steps steady and unhurried, yet each one seems to punctuate the growing tension in the air. She blinks, certain she's imagining things, but no, he's real. It's the same man from the taxi earlier, the one she dismissed so easily. The one she had been so quick to judge. Her breath catches in her throat as she watches him approach, his silhouette becoming clearer in the dim streetlight. Despite her earlier dismissive attitude, something stirs within her as she notices his calm, unhurried demeanor. There's no anger in his stride, no indication that he's come to mock her or to exact any sort of revenge. Instead, there's only the quiet, steady presence of someone who knows exactly where they stand in the world. A strange feeling churns in her stomach, guilt, perhaps? Or maybe it's something else, something more complicated, like the uncomfortable realization that she is, in fact, vulnerable. She hadn't thought about how isolated she would feel when she found herself in this situation. Alone, far from the safety of the city, with no phone signal and no one to help her. Her earlier arrogance, her attempt to control everything, now feels like a distant memory, a mistake she can't undo. The man comes closer, and she doesn't know whether to turn and run or wait for him to speak. She feels like a fool, caught between embarrassment and the rawness of her helplessness. Her mind races. What if he's here to tell her off? What if he's come to remind her of her earlier behavior, to rub her face in her own judgment? But then, just as she's about to speak, he stops a few feet away from her. The silence between them stretches, the only sounds the distant hum of city traffic and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. For a long moment, they stand there, neither of them saying a word. She watches his eyes, looking for any sign of anger or resentment, but they remain calm, neutral. It's as though nothing that happened earlier matters to him at all. "Are you okay?" he asks quietly, breaking the silence. His voice is calm, almost soothing, with none of the sharpness she'd expected. It's not accusatory, not judgmental. He doesn't sound like someone who's holding a grudge, which is exactly what she was expecting. Her mind struggles to catch up with the reality of the situation. Her pride is bristling, the part of her that wants to dismiss him again. But this time, there's something different in his words, in his tone. There's no spite, no bitterness. He's simply asking if she's okay. And somehow, that simple question, uttered so casually, seems to cut through all the walls she'd built around herself. I'm fine, she stammers, surprised at how defensive she sounds. Her words feel hollow, almost like an automatic response she's given too many times before. She can hear the weakness in her own voice, and it bothers her. She's not fine. She's stranded, isolated, and increasingly aware of just how much she needs help. He doesn't respond immediately. Instead, he looks past her at the broken-down taxi, assessing the situation. She feels a little self-conscious under his gaze, as if she's suddenly been exposed, the layers of her earlier bravado peeled away to reveal her vulnerability. "You've got a flat," he says, his tone matter-of-fact but not condescending. "Do you want me to help you get it fixed?" The words hit her harder than she expects. He's offering help. After everything she said to him, after treating him like he was beneath her, he's still offering to help her. It doesn't make sense. She wants to refuse, to brush him off, but a part of her is already softening. Maybe it's the sheer calmness in his voice, or maybe it's the recognition of how deeply she's underestimated him. Either way, her pride no longer feels as solid as it once did. For a moment, she hesitates, searching for the right words. She knows that rejecting his help again would make her seem petty, but she also fears appearing too vulnerable, too dependent. She's always prided herself on being independent, self-sufficient. But in this moment, in the silence that stretches between them, it feels foolish to keep pushing him away. He's here, offering assistance, and for some reason, she can't bring herself to turn him down. "I don't know what happened," she says, her voice softer now, more hesitant. "The driver couldn't get it started again. We're out of signal here. I didn't even think to check the flat." She feels the sting of embarrassment in her chest. It's not just the situation. It's the realization of how little she knows when it comes to dealing with things outside her comfort zone. She's used to the city, the rush of life, the feeling of control. But here, in this forgotten corner of the world, she's a stranger to herself. Without another word, he moves toward the car, effortlessly taking charge of the situation. She watches as he opens the trunk and begins rummaging through the supplies. He works with the calm efficiency of someone who has done this many times before. There's no hurry in his movements, no frustration. It's as though he's done this 100 times, offering help to strangers who find themselves in impossible situations. She stands there for a moment, caught between gratitude and disbelief. She never expected him to be the one to come through for her, especially after the way she treated him earlier. Her mind reels with the complexity of the situation. What does this mean for her? How can she reconcile her previous judgment with the reality of what's happening now? "Do you have a spare?" he asks as he pulls out the jack, his voice still calm but tinged with a touch of practicality. She nods, feeling both foolish and relieved. "Yes, I think so." "All right, let's get this done then." She steps back as he continues to work. Her earlier thoughts, those fleeting moments of judgment and superiority, are beginning to feel like a distant, embarrassing memory. She watches him move with a grace that contrasts sharply with her own anxiety. He's calm, competent, and in his quiet way, reassuring. The vulnerability she felt before is slowly being replaced by something else, a strange mix of awe and humility. As he works, she finds herself growing more and more aware of just how much she underestimated him. She dismissed him so easily, but here he is, offering his time, his knowledge, and his help. The moment is humbling, and she can't help but feel a sense of respect for him, a respect that didn't exist just hours ago. When the spare is in place and the car is running again, the woman feels an unexpected sense of relief. She looks at him, her earlier pride fading into something softer. She doesn't know how to express her gratitude, but her silence says more than words ever could. For a moment, they simply stand there, the tension between them gone, replaced by something new, an understanding that, perhaps, she's learned something important tonight. As the car hums back to life, the woman stands still for a moment, her eyes locked on the man who's just helped her. She's unsure of what to say, how to respond to this unexpected shift in the balance between them. She had expected this moment to be awkward, perhaps even a little humiliating, but instead, there's something almost comforting about the way he's handled everything. There's no trace of condescension in his actions, no hint of smugness in his gaze. He simply did what needed to be done. She nods appreciatively, the words coming more naturally than she expected. "Thank you. I really didn't expect you to help after everything earlier." The man looks at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he offers a simple smile, the kind of smile that doesn't ask for anything in return. "No problem. Everyone makes mistakes." She hesitates for a moment, still processing everything, but the reality of the situation hits her again. The taxi's not going anywhere. She can't just drive off, not with a flat tire and the night growing darker. The city feels miles away, and the thought of sitting in a broken-down car for hours, waiting for a tow, is something she can't bear. She doesn't know what it is, perhaps the isolation of the situation, or the realization that she truly has no other choice, but she knows that she has to rely on him. Would you mind coming with me?" she asks before she can stop herself. Her voice is softer now, the harsh edges of her previous arrogance dulled by the quiet vulnerability of the moment. He seems to consider it for a second, then nods. "Sure. I'll ride with you until we get somewhere safe." "No problem." They climb into the car together, the silence between them at first uncomfortable, the weight of the previous encounter hanging in the air like a cloud. The woman grips the steering wheel, focusing on the road ahead. She can feel him sitting beside her, and despite the relative silence, there's an unspoken tension that neither can ignore. It's not just the awkwardness of the situation, it's the weight of their shared history, of the things that have already passed between them. The words, the judgments, the sudden vulnerability. It all lingers. As they drive, the cityscape slowly fades behind them, and the narrow streets give way to darker, more desolate roads. It's strange, the way everything feels so different at night. The world that seemed so familiar during the day now feels foreign, ominous even. The woman glances at the man, wondering what he's thinking, but he's staring out the window, lost in thought. She wants to break the silence, to say something, anything, to bridge the distance between them, but the words don't come. "So, what's your name?" she asks after a long pause, hoping the question will make things less awkward. She realizes too late that it's an obvious question, one she should have asked earlier, but in her rush to control everything, she hadn't bothered. "Alex," he replies simply. "And you?" "Isabelle," she answers, her voice tentative, almost shy. The formality of the moment feels strange to her, and she knows it's because she's not used to feeling like this, exposed, uncertain, dependent. It's a feeling she's fought against for years, and yet here she is, unable to avoid it any longer. As they continue driving, the conversation starts to flow more easily. Isabelle finds herself asking him more questions, curious about him despite herself. She learns that he's lived in the city for years, but that he grew up in a small town. He talks about the quiet life he used to lead, how he'd often work on cars and help his neighbors. There's something about his calmness that begins to intrigue her, something about the way he approaches life that's different from everything she's known. "I guess I've always been more of a city girl," she admits, almost reluctantly. "I'm used to the noise, the rush. I don't really like being out in the middle of nowhere like this. Feels unfamiliar." Alex nods thoughtfully, his gaze still fixed on the road. "I get that. I think the city's great in its own way, but it can swallow you whole if you're not careful. You can get so caught up in the hustle that you forget what really matters." His words hit her harder than she expects, and she glances at him, surprised by the depth of his insight. She had always considered herself too busy to pay attention to things like that, too focused on work, on success, on maintaining a facade of control. But in this moment, as the car moves through the empty streets, she feels a shift in her perspective. Alex's words feel like a reminder, a quiet nudge to step back and reassess. There's something to be said for taking things slow, for not being consumed by the chaos of life. "So, what do you do?" she asks, curious to learn more about him. She's beginning to feel a strange connection to him, something she hadn't anticipated when they first crossed paths. "I'm a mechanic," Alex answers easily. "I've worked on cars for most of my life. It's not glamorous, but it's honest work. I like fixing things, making them work the way they're supposed to." Isabelle raises an eyebrow. "A mechanic? That's not exactly what I expected." He laughs, a quiet, genuine sound. Most people don't. But you'd be surprised how much there is to learn about people just by fixing their cars. There's something about the simplicity of his answer that catches Isabelle off guard. It's the first time someone has talked to her like this, without pretension, without any desire to impress. She's used to people speaking to her with calculated charm, with an agenda. But with Alex, it feels different. He's straightforward, almost to a fault, but in a way that makes her feel like she can trust him. Sometimes I think I've spent too much time trying to impress people, she says quietly, almost to herself. The words come out before she can stop them, and for a moment, she's surprised at her own vulnerability. I've always felt like I had to be perfect, like everything had to look good on the outside. I guess it's because I didn't want anyone to see how unsure I really am. Alex glances at her for a moment, and she can see a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He doesn't say anything, but the way he nods is enough. It's like he's offering her a quiet affirmation, letting her know that it's okay to be human, to be imperfect. I think we all have that pressure, he says, his voice gentle but steady. But you don't have to be perfect. You just have to be yourself. That's enough. Isabelle doesn't respond right away. His words linger in the air, resonating with something deep inside her. She feels a shift happening within herself, a quiet unraveling of the walls she's built around her heart. She had never considered letting someone in like this before, letting them see her flaws, her vulnerabilities, but in this moment, with Alex sitting next to her, it doesn't feel so terrifying. As they continue to drive, the tension between them eases. The silence is no longer uncomfortable. It's filled with the unspoken understanding that, despite everything, they're both just two people trying to make sense of their worlds. The car rounds another bend in the road, the headlights casting long shadows against the darkened trees that line the path. Isabelle's grip tightens on the steering wheel as the winding road seems to narrow, the asphalt cracking beneath the tires. The air inside the car feels heavier now, charged with an undercurrent of tension. She's trying to keep her thoughts in check, trying not to let the nagging voice of her own insecurities take over. But the farther they drive, the more she feels the weight of her situation. Isolated, vulnerable, far from the safety of the city she knows so well. Alex has been quiet for the last few minutes, his eyes focused out the window, his posture relaxed. She can feel his presence beside her, steady and grounded, and yet she feels more out of place than ever. The silence is deafening, pressing against her chest, and for the first time since they've been together, she feels the gap between them widen. It's not just the physical distance, but something else, something deeper, something she can't quite name but can't ignore. As the road continues to stretch before them, Isabelle's thoughts begin to race. She's not used to feeling so exposed. Everything that had once felt under control now feels like it's slipping away. The smooth facade of confidence she's relied on for years is starting to crack. She doesn't like this feeling, this unfamiliar, uncomfortable vulnerability. Then, just as she's about to break the silence, something unexpected happens. The car hits a sharp bump in the road, throwing them both off balance. Isabelle jerks the wheel instinctively, her breath catching in her throat. The tires screech as they swerve toward the edge of the road, and for a heart-stopping second, she's certain they're going to crash. Alex's hand shoots out to steady her, gripping the armrest with surprising force. "Whoa, slow down," he warns, his voice suddenly sharp, a stark contrast to his usual calm tone. Isabelle's heart is racing in her chest, her hands trembling on the wheel. She feels her pulse quicken, panic rising inside her like a tide she can't control. Her body stiffens as the adrenaline floods her system. It's not just the close call, it's everything. The isolation, the fact that they're miles away from any help, the tension that has been building all night. All of it crashes down on her in that moment. "I know what I'm doing," she snaps, her voice louder than she intended, sharp with irritation. The words are out before she can stop them, her own panic causing the outburst. She feels a flush of anger creeping up her neck, her chest tight with the weight of her own anxiety. "You don't have to act like I'm some kind of idiot. I've been driving for years." Alex looks at her, surprised by the sudden intensity of her response. His eyes narrow, his hand slowly retracting from the armrest, but he doesn't say anything right away. Isabelle's breath comes in shallow bursts, the air thick with the sound of her heartbeat pounding in her ears. She can feel her pulse in her throat, in her temples, in the tips of her fingers. A tense silence falls between them, and the atmosphere in the car shifts, heavy with unspoken words. Isabelle feels the weight of the moment, the anger simmering beneath the surface. She doesn't know why she's reacting like this, why she's snapping at him, why everything feels so out of control. She knows she shouldn't be this angry, but the words keep coming, spilling out of her like a dam that's finally broken. "You don't get it, do you?" she continues, her voice trembling with the force of the emotion she's barely able to contain. "You think you're better than me just because you're calm. Just because you don't get worked up over every little thing. Well, I do. I'm not like you. I can't just sit here and act like everything's fine when it's not." Alex's expression shifts, his features hardening slightly. He's been patient with her, understanding, offering his help when she needed it. But now, as the words spill from her mouth, he looks at her with something new, a mixture of disbelief and frustration. "What the hell are you talking about?" he finally says, his voice rising. "I'm not acting like I'm better than you. I'm trying to help you. But you keep pushing me away. Because you can't handle the fact that maybe, just maybe, I'm not the one who's wrong here." The words hit Isabelle like a slap in the face. She feels the sting of them, a bitter realization that what she's been saying, what she's been feeling, is not just unfair, it's cruel. She can hear the hurt in his voice, the quiet accusation that cuts deeper than anything she's ever heard. For a second, she feels a surge of shame, the kind that presses down on her chest and makes it hard to breathe. But then, in the midst of the shame, something else bubbles up. It's anger, sharp and blinding, anger that she hasn't fully acknowledged until now. Anger that she's been carrying with her for years, buried under the layers of control and perfectionism she's wrapped herself in. It's the anger of being judged, of being constantly expected to perform, to prove herself. "I'm not like you," she spits, her voice trembling with fury. "You think you have it all figured out, but you don't. You don't know what it's like to be in my shoes. To have to fight for every damn thing you get, to be looked at like you don't belong. You don't get it, Alex. You don't know what it's like to feel like you're always one step behind, always trying to catch up." The words are out before she can stop them, and as soon as they're said, she realizes how wrong they are. How unfair they are. But the damage is done. The silence that follows is heavy, thick with the weight of her outburst, and for a moment, neither of them speaks. Isabelle feels her heart racing in her chest, the anger still simmering beneath her skin, but now it's mixed with guilt. She wishes she could take it back, but she knows she can't. Alex doesn't respond right away. Instead, he looks out the window, his jaw clenched. His silence speaks louder than any words could. The tension between them is palpable, a thick cloud that hangs over the car. Isabelle tries to calm herself, but the words still echo in her head, the shame and anger warring within her. Finally, Alex speaks, his voice quieter than before, but with a depth of sadness that makes Isabelle's heart twist. "You don't have to prove anything to me," he says softly. "I'm not judging you. But you're hurting yourself by holding on to all that anger. You don't have to carry it anymore." The words settle over Isabelle like a weight, and she feels the walls around her begin to crack. She doesn't know how to respond. Part of her wants to lash out again, to push him away, but another part of her, the part that's been growing ever since she met him, wants to listen, wants to understand. For the first time, she feels the full extent of her own prejudice, her own insecurities, laid bare. And she doesn't know how to deal with it. She grips the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles turning white as the car continues down the dark road. The silence between them is thick with the weight of their confrontation, and yet, in that moment, Isabelle knows something has shifted between them. She's not sure if it's for better or worse, but she knows that this moment, the confrontation, the rawness of it, has opened a door. Whether or not she's ready to walk through it is another question entirely. The silence between them stretches, long and heavy, as the car hums along the desolate road. Isabelle's heart pounds in her chest, the adrenaline from their earlier confrontation still coursing through her veins. Her breath is shallow, the weight of her own words pressing against her like a physical force. She had never meant to lash out at Alex. Not like that, not with such venom, but in that moment, something inside her had snapped. The pressure she felt, the fear, the insecurity, all of it had boiled over, and she had taken it out on him. She glances at him now, her eyes flickering toward his face, but he's staring out the window, his expression unreadable. She doesn't know what to expect, whether he's angry, disappointed, or simply indifferent. Part of her expects him to say something, to retaliate, to match her tone with his own sharp words. But nothing comes. The car is filled with the soft hum of the engine, the occasional click of the turn signal, and the tension in the air that refuses to dissipate. Alex's calmness is unsettling. He hasn't shouted, hasn't raised his voice in return. His silence isn't one of anger, but of something else, something that Isabelle can't quite put her finger on. It's almost as though he's giving her the space to process what just happened, to let the words hang in the air and settle before he says anything more. The fact that he isn't reacting the way she expected only makes her feel more uncomfortable, more exposed. Her mind races, replaying the moment over and over again, the sharpness of her words, the sudden eruption of anger, the bitterness that had spilled out before she could stop it. She's used to being in control of herself, to being the one who manages every situation with a sense of poise and authority. But here, with Alex, she's felt something she's never experienced before: vulnerability. It's an uncomfortable feeling, one that she's always worked to avoid, and she hates it. Hates how he's made her question everything she's ever known about herself, her assumptions, and her beliefs. She doesn't know how much time passes before she speaks, but when the words come, they feel like an admission, a confession of sorts. "I didn't mean to say what I did," she says, her voice soft, almost tentative. It's the first time since their confrontation that she's acknowledged the hurt she caused, the first time she's taken responsibility for the things she said. I don't know what happened. I panicked. And I lashed out." Alex doesn't turn to look at her right away, but she can see the subtle shift in his posture. His shoulders relax just slightly, and the tension that had been building between them begins to ease. He lets the silence stretch for a moment before responding, his voice measured but gentle. "It's okay," he says simply. "I get it. You were scared. We all react differently when we're scared." The simplicity of his response catches Isabelle off guard. She had expected him to be angry, or to tell her she was in the wrong. She had prepared herself for a confrontation, a moment where he would demand an apology or call her out for her behavior. But instead, he's being understanding, too understanding, in a way that makes her feel even more guilty. "I don't," Isabelle begins, but her words falter. She doesn't know how to explain herself, how to make him understand what she's feeling. The walls she's built around herself are starting to crumble, and it terrifies her. She's not used to letting someone see her like this, vulnerable, unsure, exposed. But Alex's calm demeanor doesn't falter. He's not judging her, not looking at her like she's somehow beneath him. He's simply offering her an opportunity to be honest with herself, to acknowledge the fear and uncertainty that had driven her to lash out. "I don't know why I do it," she admits, her voice low, almost inaudible. "I don't know why I push people away, why I act like I'm better than everyone. It's like I'm scared that if I don't, I'll lose everything I've worked for. That if I let my guard down, if I let people see who I really am, they'll see me as weak." Alex glances at her briefly, his gaze soft, his expression unreadable. "You're not weak," he says simply. "Being vulnerable doesn't make you weak. It just makes you human." Isabelle looks at him in surprise, his words sinking in deeper than she wants to admit. She spent so many years hiding behind a mask of strength, of control, convinced that vulnerability was something to be avoided at all costs. But Alex is telling her something different, something she's never considered before. For the first time, she feels a flicker of doubt about everything she's believed in, the walls she's built, the way she's always distanced herself from others, the way she's convinced herself that showing vulnerability is a weakness. Maybe it isn't. Maybe there's something to be said for letting go of the need to be perfect, for embracing the parts of herself that she's tried so hard to suppress. She opens her mouth to say something more, but before she can, Alex speaks again. "You don't have to apologize for your feelings, Isabelle. I get it. We all have our baggage. but you don't have to carry it alone." His words hang in the air, and for a moment, Isabelle doesn't know how to respond. She's not used to hearing this kind of compassion, this kind of understanding. It's not something she's ever expected from someone like him. Someone who, at first glance, seemed so different from her, so far removed from her world. But here he is, offering her kindness when she least deserves it, and it makes her question everything she's ever known about herself. "I don't know what to say," she admits, her voice cracking slightly. "I've never really had anyone say that to me before. I've always thought that if I showed weakness, people would walk all over me. I thought I had to be tough, to be perfect, to get ahead. But maybe I was wrong." Alex doesn't say anything at first, letting her words hang in the air between them. The car continues to hum down the darkened road, but Isabelle doesn't feel the same urgency she did before. The tension in the car has shifted. Now, there's a quiet understanding between them, a recognition of shared humanity. She realizes, with a pang of guilt, that she has been carrying these biases, these walls, for far too long. She's been so focused on maintaining control, on keeping her emotions in check, that she's forgotten how to just be real with people. How to be honest, not just with them, but with herself. As the road stretches on, Isabelle begins to feel something inside her shift. It's not something she can put into words just yet, but it's there. A quiet realization, a dawning understanding that maybe, just maybe, she doesn't have to be the person she's been all her life. Maybe she can let go of the anger, the defensiveness, and start seeing people, not as obstacles to be avoided or conquered, but as individuals with their own struggles, their own humanity. She looks at Alex again, really looks at him this time, and for the first time since they met, she sees him, not as a stranger, not as someone she's been forced to interact with, but as a person. A real person with his own thoughts, his own feelings. And suddenly, it's like the walls she's built around herself start to come down, just a little. "I don't know where this road is taking us," she says, her voice softer now, "but I'm glad you're here. I'm sorry for what I said earlier. You didn't deserve that." Alex smiles, the kind of smile that reaches his eyes, soft and understanding. "It's okay. We all make mistakes. It's what we do after that matters." Isabelle nods, the words sinking in deeper than she expects. She's not sure if she's ready to fully let go of her past, of the things she's been holding on to for so long, but for the first time, she feels like it's possible. Maybe, just maybe, there's a different way to see the world. And maybe, with Alex's unexpected kindness, she's starting to see it more clearly. The quiet tension that had been building between them hangs in the air like a storm cloud, but it's a far cry from the calm that once marked their interactions. Isabelle can feel the unease creeping up her spine as the car bumps along the narrow, isolated road, its headlights casting long, ghostly shadows across the twisted trees. The air inside the vehicle is thick with unspoken words, a mixture of guilt and confusion that makes it difficult for Isabelle to breathe. Her thoughts are scattered, consumed by the overwhelming sense that things are slipping out of control. Despite the shift in their dynamic, despite the tentative truce they've reached after their confrontation, something still feels off. Her mind replays their argument, her outburst, the way she had thrown her biases and insecurities in his face, only to be met with calm understanding. Alex had done nothing to deserve her wrath, and yet he had responded with quiet patience, never once raising his voice or getting defensive. It should have made her feel better, but instead, it only highlights the vast divide between them. Now, as they continue down the darkened road, a growing sense of discomfort settles over Isabelle. The trees seem to close in around them, casting eerie shadows that play tricks on her mind. The isolation of their surroundings, the emptiness of the land, makes her stomach tighten. She's never been a fan of being alone, of feeling cut off from the world, and tonight, that fear is only amplified by the strange, haunting quiet that has enveloped them both. She keeps glancing at Alex, trying to gauge his mood, but he's once again focused on the road ahead, his expression calm and unreadable. Suddenly, the car lurches violently, throwing both of them forward in their seats. Isabelle's heart leaps into her throat, and her hands instinctively grip the seatbelt as the vehicle swerves sharply to the right, its tires skidding on the loose gravel that lines the edge of the road. The The world outside the window blurs into a streak of dark shadows and flashing lights as the car veers dangerously close to the steep drop on the side of the road. Isabelle's breath catches in her throat, and her stomach drops as she feels the car tipping precariously toward the edge. "Hold on," Alex shouts, his voice sharp and commanding as he yanks the steering wheel back in the opposite direction. The tires screech, their grip failing on the loose gravel as the car fishtails violently. Isabelle's heart pounds, her chest tight with panic. She can hear the sound of metal grinding against stone, the scraping of tires on the edge of the road, and the deafening rush of adrenaline filling her ears. The car jolts again, this time more violently, as Alex struggles to regain control. Isabelle feels a momentary sense of weightlessness, as though time itself has stretched out, holding them suspended in the air before they come crashing back to reality. The car swerves again, this time harder, and Isabelle's body slams against the door, the impact knocking the breath from her lungs. "Alex!" Isabelle gasps, her voice high-pitched with fear. "What's happening?" "I can't." Alex's voice is tight, strained with the effort of keeping the car from careening off the edge. "The road's too slick, and I can't get enough traction to pull us back. Hold on." The car slides again, the front wheels skimming dangerously close to the drop, and Isabelle's panic spikes. Her body tenses, the fear gripping her like a vice. Her mind races. This is it. This is how it ends. A dark, deserted road, a car skidding out of control, and no one around to help. She can feel the car tipping again, the front end sinking toward the edge as the gravel beneath the tires shifts. The drop below looks endless, a yawning chasm waiting to swallow them whole. In that split second, something inside Isabelle snaps. She realizes she's not going to get out of this by simply panicking. Her usual response, the cold control that she's relied on her entire life, doesn't matter here. It's useless. All the walls she's built, the judgment she's held onto, the pride that has defined her for so long, none of it is going to save her now. For the first time, she realizes that it's not enough to be strong or in control. In this moment, what she needs is trust. Trust in someone else. She looks at Alex, and for the first time, she sees him not as a stranger, not as someone she's clashed with, but as a person, someone who might just be the only chance she has. His hands are steady on the wheel, his eyes focused on the road, and though there's tension in his jaw, he's not panicking. He's calm, almost unnervingly so, and in that calmness, Isabelle feels something stir inside her. She has no choice now. She has to trust him. "Alex!" She screams, her voice raw with desperation. "Please!" Alex's head snaps toward her, his eyes widening as he realizes the gravity of the situation. But then, with no hesitation, he gives one last firm yank on the steering wheel. The car veers back to the left, and Isabelle feels the tires regain a bit of traction. It's enough to stop the car from tipping over the edge, but it's still not enough to stabilize them entirely. "Help me!" Isabelle yells, her voice cracking as she clutches the seat. "Do whatever you can, just don't let us fall." Alex doesn't waste time with words. Without a second thought, he reaches across the car and pulls at the gearshift, slamming it into a lower gear to gain more control. His eyes flash toward Isabelle for just a split second, his expression hard but determined, and then he turns back to the road, his hands steady as he works the wheel with a precision that makes Isabelle's heart skip a beat. The car jerks again, and for a moment, Isabelle thinks it's over. But then, slowly, gradually, they start to regain control. The back end of the car slides sideways as the tires grip the road once more, but Alex doesn't falter. His calmness in the face of the danger is nothing short of remarkable, and in that moment, Isabelle realizes how little she knows about him. About his capacity for control, his ability to act under pressure, and how, perhaps, she's misjudged him entirely. With one final, intense swerve, the car lurches back onto more stable ground. The tires grip the road with a harsh screech as the vehicle comes to a full stop, the engine idling. The world seems to stand still for a moment, the danger past, but the adrenaline still buzzing in Isabelle's veins. Isabelle's breath is ragged, her chest rising and falling in frantic bursts. Her hands tremble as they grip the seatbelt, as though she might still be in the midst of the danger. The car is still. She's alive. They're alive. Alex takes a moment to catch his breath, his hands resting on the wheel. He doesn't look at her at first, his focus still on the road ahead, as though processing what just happened. Finally, he turns to her, his expression softened but still serious. "You okay?" he asks, his voice quieter now, a hint of concern in it. Isabelle nods, but she's not sure if she's entirely sure of her own response. I think so. I don't know. That was close," Alex finishes for her, his voice low. He exhales deeply, rubbing his hand over his face. "But we made it." Isabelle looks at him, really looks at him, for the first time since all of this began. The calmness in his eyes is no longer unnerving to her, it's a lifeline. She's still processing everything that happened, everything she's just learned about herself, but one thing is crystal clear now. She can trust him. For the first time, she's not sure of much, but she's sure of that. And that's enough. The car sits idling at the edge of the road, the hum of the engine the only sound breaking the heavy silence between them. The danger has passed, but the tension still lingers in the air, thick with everything they've just endured. Isabelle's heart is still racing, her hands trembling slightly as she lets go of the seatbelt, though she knows the immediate threat is over. She feels a strange mix of relief and lingering anxiety, the kind that comes from realizing how close they came to disaster. But as her breath begins to slow, another realization creeps in. The fear she felt moments ago was no longer just about the car or the road. It was about something deeper, something she hadn't allowed herself to confront until now. Alex, calm and steady as ever, shifts the car into drive, glancing at her briefly before pulling back onto the road. His focus is unwavering, his hands firm on the wheel as he guides the vehicle toward the next stretch of their journey. Isabelle watches him closely, noticing the quiet confidence in his every movement. There's no panic in his demeanor, no trace of the fear that had consumed her. Instead, there's only a quiet determination, a sense that he's been through worse and knows exactly what to do when the stakes are high. For the first time since the incident, Isabelle feels herself relax, though only slightly. She's not sure what to say, whether she should apologize again, or thank him for saving them, or just let the silence between them speak for itself. But before she can make up her mind, Alex speaks, his voice steady but softer now, as though the adrenaline has worn off and they can finally acknowledge the gravity of what happened. "You're okay," he says simply, his eyes glancing at her for a moment before returning to the road. "We're almost there." Isabelle nods, her voice a little shaky when she speaks. "Yeah, I'm okay. Just, that was too close." Alex doesn't respond right away, but she feels the weight of his gaze on her again. There's something in the way he looks at her, almost as if he's seeing her in a new light. It's not pity or judgment, but something else, something that makes Isabelle feel like she's being understood, really understood, for the first time in a long while. "Sometimes," he says slowly, "we have to go through moments like that to realize what we're capable of." Isabelle glances at him, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "I mean that, when it's all on the line, when we're at our most vulnerable, we find out what really matters," Alex replies, his voice low. "We find out who we really are, who we trust. And sometimes it's not about being in control. It's about trusting the people around you." Isabelle doesn't know how to respond. She feels the words settle in her chest, stirring something she hadn't allowed herself to feel before, a sense of vulnerability. A sense that maybe, just maybe, she's been holding on to control for the wrong reasons. Maybe all the walls she's built around herself, all the judgments she's held onto, are just a defense mechanism against something she's afraid to face. They continue driving, the road stretching out before them as they leave the chaotic moments behind, but Isabelle knows she's not the same person she was when they first met. Something inside her has shifted. The wall she's spent years building, brick by brick, has cracked. And though she's not sure what the future holds, she knows she's not facing it alone anymore. Soon, the car approaches the edge of a small town, the lights of the city beginning to appear in the distance. Isabelle feels a strange mix of emotions, relief, gratitude, but also something else. Something she can't quite define yet. They've made it through the worst of it, but she knows that the experience has changed them both. The quiet, unspoken understanding that has settled between them now feels like an anchor, a connection that wasn't there before, and she can't quite shake the feeling that they're both on the cusp of something new. As the car slows and pulls into a gas station, Isabelle turns to Alex, her voice a little softer than usual. I want to say thank you. For everything. For helping me when you didn't have to." Alex nods, his gaze warm but steady. "You don't have to thank me. I just did what anyone would do." But Isabelle can't help the small, genuine smile that tugs at her lips. "Oh, not anyone would do that. Not like you did." Alex shrugs, a modest smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Sometimes it's just about showing up. And doing what needs to be done." Isabelle nods, her gaze lingering on him for a moment longer than usual. There's something in his eyes, something that tells her he understands more than he lets on. And for the first time, she's okay with that. She doesn't need to have all the answers right now. She just needs to keep moving forward. And, for once, she's not afraid of doing that with someone else by her side. As the car pulls to a stop, the tension that once filled the air has dissipated, replaced by something else. Something lighter. Something hopeful. Isabelle knows there's still a long way to go before she can truly let go of her fears, her prejudices, but for now, she's taking a step forward. One step closer to trusting herself and the people around her. "You're safe now," Alex says, his voice steady, pulling her from her thoughts. "It's over." Isabelle exhales slowly, her shoulders relaxing as she realizes that he's right. It is over. And whatever comes next, they'll face it together. As the car pulls into the quiet, dimly lit parking lot, the engine hums to a stop, and Isabelle sits still for a moment. The world around her feels quieter now, as though the storm of emotions that had swept through her earlier has finally begun to settle. Her hands rest on her lap, still slightly trembling from the fear and adrenaline, but there's a new sense of clarity in her chest, something she hadn't expected to find in the midst of chaos. She exhales slowly, her gaze drifting out the window toward the quiet town that seems to have held its breath alongside her. The weight of the experience they just shared feels heavier now, sinking in with each passing second. She's always prided herself on being self-sufficient, on never needing anyone. But tonight, something in her has cracked open. The walls she'd so carefully built around herself, her prejudices, her stubbornness, her refusal to rely on others, no longer seem as impenetrable. The truth is, she doesn't have all the answers. She can't control everything. And maybe that's okay. Isabelle turns her head toward Alex, her breath catching in her throat as she finally looks at him with the clarity she's been avoiding. He's sitting with his hands still resting lightly on the wheel, his gaze focused straight ahead. He hasn't said much since they arrived, but there's a calm about him now, a stillness that matches her own sense of quiet. She wonders, for a brief moment, what he's thinking. What's going on behind those steady eyes that had helped guide them both through the chaos of the night? She starts, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to thank you." Alex glances over at her, his eyes warm but measured, as though he understands the weight of her words without needing any explanation. "You don't have to," he says softly. "I did what anyone would do in that situation." But Isabelle shakes her head, the words catching in her throat as she struggles to find the right ones. "No," she murmurs, her eyes locking onto his. "Not anyone. Not like you." For a long moment, they sit in silence. Isabelle feels a lump form in her throat, the quiet reflection of everything she's been through washing over her in waves. She knows she's changed in some small but significant way tonight. She can feel it, deep in her bones. What started as a simple, tense car ride has morphed into something much more profound. The fear, the vulnerability, the hesitation, it's all shifted in her heart, and she's left with a sense of gratitude she never expected. It's not just the fact that Alex helped her survive the terrifying moment on the road. It's more than that. It's the way he never judged her, even when she acted out of fear and ignorance. The way he chose to be patient, kind, and understanding, even when she didn't deserve it. The calmness he exuded in the face of danger was not just a reflection of his skill, but of his character. And in that moment, Isabelle realizes something that takes her completely by surprise. She's been looking at the world all wrong. For so long, she's been caught up in her own assumptions, her own narrow view of the world and the people around her. She's let her biases cloud her judgment, never giving herself the opportunity to truly see someone for who they are. But Alex had shown her a different way, a way of seeing beyond the surface, beyond the labels and judgments she had placed on him, on everyone, really. He had shown her what it means to truly trust, to put faith in someone else, even when it feels uncomfortable. And for that, Isabelle knows she will be forever grateful. "I'm sorry," she says quietly, her voice trembling slightly as she looks away, the weight of her apology heavy in the air. "For everything. The way I treated you. The way I saw you. I was wrong." Alex doesn't respond immediately, but his expression softens as he takes in her words. He's not angry. He's not bitter. Instead, there's a quiet understanding in his eyes, as though he knows how hard it is for her to admit this, to confront the truth about herself. "It's okay," he says finally, his voice gentle. "I get it. I'm just glad we're okay." Isabelle nods, her throat tight as she exhales a shaky breath. For the first time, she feels the weight of the last few hours, of the fear, the confrontation, the confusion, begin to lift. The walls inside her heart feel a little less fortified, and for the first time in a long while, she feels lighter. Not just because she's physically safe, but because something inside her has shifted. She's finally allowed herself to see the world and the people in it with a little more clarity, a little more openness. And she knows that this change, this growth, will stay with her long after tonight. As the car finally comes to a stop, Isabelle looks out the window at the dimly lit street ahead of them. She doesn't know what the future holds or how the rest of her journey will unfold, but for the first time, she's not afraid to face it. Because she's learned that sometimes, the hardest things, like trust, vulnerability, and growth, are the ones that end up making all the difference. And she has Alex to thank for helping her see that. The days following the incident feel different to Isabelle, as though the world around her is unfolding in a way that is both familiar and new. She's always been a woman of control, reserved, self-assured, and perhaps too rigid in her views. But since the car ride, since that terrifying, life-altering moment, something has subtly shifted inside her. She can't quite pinpoint when it happened or exactly how, but the change is undeniable. The first noticeable shift comes in her interactions with others. At work, Isabelle finds herself holding back from the quick, automatic judgments she used to make. Where before she might have dismissed someone based on their tone, their appearance, or their background, she now takes a moment to pause, to listen, and to understand. She's less quick to assume, more open to hearing people out before making up her mind. It's not that she's suddenly become a different person, but she's become more aware of her biases, those little judgments that she used to think of as harmless, but which now seem far more corrosive. For example, she notices it when she speaks to her colleagues. There's a woman in the office, Karen, who Isabelle has always thought of as overly dramatic and somewhat tiresome. In the past, she would have brushed off Karen's ideas with a cold, dismissive attitude, eager to move on to what she deemed more important matters. But after the experience with Alex, Isabelle finds herself listening to Karen more attentively, nodding as she explains her new project idea. She realizes she had been too quick to label Karen, to box her into an image that had little to do with the person standing before her. And as she listens, Isabelle feels a sense of connection that she's not used to, a feeling of being more present, more engaged with the people around her. Outside of work, the change is more subtle, but no less significant. On a casual weekend stroll through the city, Isabelle notices how much more aware she is of the world around her. She walks past a group of street vendors, and instead of moving along quickly, avoiding eye contact as she usually does, she slows her pace. She finds herself making small talk with a vendor selling handmade bracelets. She listens to his story about how he started his business, about his life back home, and for the first time, she doesn't feel the need to hurry. She lets the conversation unfold without rushing to get back to her comfort zone. It's a small shift, but to Isabelle, it feels like a profound change. There's an openness now, a willingness to engage that she never felt before. Even her inner dialogue has shifted. Where once she might have been harsh with herself, holding herself to unrealistic standards and criticizing every perceived failure, now she's kinder. After a tough day, instead of retreating into her usual habit of berating herself for any mistake, she allows herself a moment of grace. She gives herself credit for trying, for doing her best, for showing up. It's a small shift in mindset, but it has a ripple effect on her self-esteem and overall sense of well-being. She feels more at peace with who she is, flaws and all, than she ever has before. And perhaps most telling of all, Isabelle finds herself thinking of Alex more often. Not in the sense of a romantic interest or with guilt over the way she treated him, but with a deep sense of gratitude. She reflects on how he had shown her kindness and patience when she least deserved it, how he had helped her in ways she didn't even realize she needed. The moment of fear on that isolated road had cracked something open inside her, something that had been buried for a long time. She'd always prided herself on her independence, but she now recognizes that true strength isn't just about standing alone. It's about knowing when to let your guard down, when to trust others, and when to show vulnerability. The change is gradual, but in the weeks that follow, Isabelle begins to embrace it more fully. She starts to reach out more, to connect with others in ways that she hadn't before. At a social gathering, she strikes up a conversation with someone she would have previously avoided, and finds herself enjoying the exchange. She starts saying yes to invitations, accepting help when offered, and seeking new experiences. The woman who once sought control above all else is now allowing herself to go with the flow a bit more, to let life unfold rather than forcing it into a mold. It's not that she's suddenly become someone else. Her core, her values, the things that define her, are still there. But Isabelle is changing. She's more open to the nuances of people, the complexities of situations, and the messiness of human connection. The walls she had built around herself are crumbling, not in a dramatic collapse, but in small, subtle ways that allow the world to come in more fully. The shift may not always be visible to those around her, but Isabelle feels it in her heart and mind, and for the first time, she's at peace with it. In the quiet moments, when she reflects on everything that has happened, Isabelle realizes something important. The experience with Alex, with the vulnerability she was forced to confront, didn't just teach her how to trust someone else. It taught her how to trust herself, to be kinder to herself, to open herself up to growth, and to allow change to happen without fear. And in that realization, she finds something even more valuable than control: the freedom to be imperfect and still worthy. As Isabelle's life begins to settle into this new rhythm, the weight of what she's learned from the ordeal starts to sink in more deeply. She hadn't expected a single moment, a single incident, to shift her perspective so completely. But as the days pass, she reflects on everything that led up to that moment and the series of small, pivotal choices she had made, choices that had brought her face to face with her own biases, fears, and vulnerabilities. At first, it had been easy to dismiss the encounter with Alex as just another challenge, something to endure and move past. But now, Isabelle understands it was far more than that. The events of that night, the way they unfolded with such raw honesty and intensity, had cracked open a layer of herself she had carefully concealed for years. In the past, she would have hidden behind walls of judgment, resisting the discomfort of facing her own shortcomings. But this time, the experience had forced her to confront those walls, to see how much they had isolated her not just from others, but from herself. The moral of the story, Isabelle realizes, isn't about simply learning to trust others, though that's certainly part of it. It's about understanding that trust, both in others and in oneself, isn't something that can be earned by perfection or control. Trust is born out of vulnerability. It's about being willing to let go of the fear that makes us hold tight to our assumptions and prejudices, and instead allowing ourselves to see people, situations, and life as they truly are: imperfect, complex, and full of unexpected beauty. For Isabelle, that was the true revelation. It wasn't just that Alex had helped her when she was at her lowest point, or that he had shown kindness in the face of her own cruelty. It was that, through him, she had seen a reflection of herself, the parts of her that she had been running from, the fears she had buried deep inside. She had thought she was strong because she could stand alone, but what she had learned was that real strength comes from the courage to face one's vulnerabilities and allow others to help carry the load. This is where the real lesson lies. We often build walls to protect ourselves, to avoid the discomfort of facing our own biases and limitations. But those walls, while seemingly safe, isolate us from the very experiences and relationships that can help us grow. True growth, Isabelle understands now, comes when we are willing to break down those walls, when we allow ourselves to experience the world without preconceptions and fear. It's in these moments of openness that we find out who we truly are and what we're capable of. The journey Isabelle has been on isn't just about forgiveness or changing her views of others. It's about the ongoing process of self-awareness and self-acceptance. It's about understanding that people, every person we meet, are more than the labels we put on them. They are more than their appearances, their actions, and their mistakes. We all have stories, wounds, and moments of vulnerability that define us in ways we might not even fully understand. And when we allow ourselves to see others with that same openness, we open the door to deeper connections and, in turn, deeper self-understanding. Isabelle now realizes that her relationship with Alex, while a catalyst for her growth, wasn't the end of her transformation. It was just the beginning. The real work comes in the days and months ahead, when she must continue to practice the lessons she's learned, not just in moments of crisis, but in every ordinary interaction, every choice she makes, and every judgment she casts. Trust, vulnerability, and openness are ongoing practices, not one-time lessons, and Isabelle feels ready to take on that challenge. The moral of the story, then, is simple but profound. To truly connect with others, we must first learn to connect with ourselves, and in doing so, we open the door to a richer, more compassionate world. One where we are not just survivors of our circumstances, but active participants in the shared human experience. It is only through this openness that we can truly begin to heal, both ourselves and the relationships we have with the people around us. Isabelle stands at the edge of her apartment building, a letter in her hands, the cool evening air brushing past her as she hesitates for a moment. The envelope feels heavier than it should, laden with unspoken words and emotions that have been swirling inside her since that fateful night. She's thought about this moment countless times, about how to make it right, how to express everything she's been feeling in a way that's not rushed or flippant. She's been reflecting on the days that followed the ordeal with Alex, the way he had shown her unexpected kindness and the depth of her own biases that had been laid bare in such a raw and humbling way. After all this time, after all the small shifts within herself, she realizes that apologizing, truly apologizing, isn't just about saying the words. It's about making a real effort to express gratitude and to own the harm that was done. And so, after days of contemplation, she's finally written the letter. In it, she writes about the things she's learned, the ways in which Alex's calm and unwavering kindness forced her to confront the uglier parts of herself. She talks about the fear she felt when she was stranded, and how she's come to understand that trust isn't just a one-way street. It's mutual. It's about letting go of preconceived notions and learning to see the humanity in others, even when they don't fit neatly into the box we've created for them. But most importantly, she writes from a place of deep gratitude, acknowledging that he didn't owe her anything, yet he still chose to be the person who showed up for her when she needed it the most. Isabelle had been afraid to reach out before. She was afraid of being rejected, of her apology being dismissed as insincere or hollow. But as she rereads the letter, she realizes that it doesn't matter what his response might be. What matters is that she's taking this step, this small but meaningful act of reaching out, and making amends for her actions. She's learning in this moment that sometimes the most difficult thing is to make yourself vulnerable again, to open yourself up to the possibility of growth and healing, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. She folds the letter carefully, seals it in the envelope, and takes a deep breath. For a moment, the weight of the world feels present again. The city stretches out before her, full of all the noise, the distractions, the judgments she's fought against her whole life. But for the first time, she feels something different, a sense of quiet resolve. She doesn't need to have everything figured out. She doesn't need to know how everything will unfold. She simply needs to take the step and trust that it's the right thing to do. Later that evening, she places the letter in the mailbox, her fingers lingering for a moment before she pulls her hand away. She knows she has done the right thing. She has taken a risk, opened her heart, and sent a message that speaks to more than just an apology. It speaks to the changes within her, to the person she is becoming, and to the things she's willing to leave behind in order to grow. As she walks back to her apartment, she reflects on the road ahead. This letter may be just one small part of her journey, but it is a powerful reminder of what it takes to make amends, to seek forgiveness, and to ultimately begin to heal. There's no guarantee that Alex will ever read it, or that it will lead to any immediate resolution, but Isabelle knows that it's not the response that matters. What matters is the sincerity of the action and the humility in taking that first step toward making things right. Moral resolution asterisk. In the quiet after sending the letter, Isabelle feels a sense of peace settle over her. The moral of her journey isn't simply about learning to trust others or to apologize. It's about realizing that growth doesn't happen in isolation. We are shaped by the people we meet, by the kindness and challenges that come into our lives. Sometimes, the most difficult lessons come from facing our own flaws and taking responsibility for how we treat others. But it's only when we are willing to be vulnerable, willing to confront the discomfort of our own mistakes, that we can begin to experience true change. The moral of the story is simple. True growth is found when we open ourselves to the discomfort of change, when we take responsibility for our actions, and when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable enough to make amends. It's through these actions, of acknowledging our flaws, asking for forgiveness, and committing to becoming better, that we can find the path to healing and reconciliation, both with others and within ourselves. Alex had never expected to receive a letter from Isabelle. In fact, he hadn't expected anything at all. After their encounter in the desolate stretch of road, he had helped her without a second thought, driven by the simple principle that kindness should be extended without conditions. The night had left him unsettled, but not because of her hostility. He understood that kind of behavior. No, what left him thinking for days was the realization of how deeply ingrained some prejudices were, how difficult it could be to undo years of narrow perceptions, and how those perceptions could sometimes be mirrored in others. He had been deeply aware of his own biases in the past, and that understanding had shaped his worldview. When he read the letter from Isabelle, Alex was struck by the sincerity in her words. He felt a quiet, profound respect for her for doing something that many people never do, owning up to their faults. It wasn't easy to apologize, especially when it involved the discomfort of recognizing one's own biases. He knew that much. Still, as he reflected on her words, Alex couldn't help but think about the larger picture. The encounter hadn't just been about him or Isabelle. It had been about the way society often conditioned people to judge one another before taking the time to see them as they truly were. And while Isabelle's change was admirable, it was more than just a personal journey for her. It was a reminder that the work of breaking down prejudices is ongoing and requires intentional action, not just acknowledgement. He took a deep breath as he thought about how he could respond, what he could say that would reflect the lessons he had learned, and how important it was to not just forgive but also to teach, to encourage understanding. The truth was, he had felt no malice toward Isabelle, even in that initial moment of tension. He had seen her fear, her defensiveness, and he had recognized it for what it was, something deeper than surface-level hostility. It was rooted in a lifetime of assumptions, of comfort zones that had never been challenged. But even so, kindness had always been Alex's response. He had grown up learning that kindness was the bridge between prejudice and understanding, that offering patience in the face of judgment was one of the most powerful things you could do for yourself and for others. In the letter, Isabelle had acknowledged his kindness, but to him, it was more than a mere act of generosity. It was a way of breaking the cycle. Kindness wasn't just an action, it was a choice. And the more you chose to extend it, the more it had the power to transform both the giver and the receiver. Alex thought about how much he had changed over the years, too. He had faced prejudice in his own life, experiences where he had been judged and dismissed based on nothing more than his skin color or his background. But instead of responding with bitterness or anger, he had always tried to find a way to respond with empathy. He had come to understand that prejudice was a two-way street, and while it was important to stand up for oneself, it was equally important to find ways to help others recognize their own biases. In his response to Isabelle, Alex would emphasize this. Kindness was not just a passive act, but an active choice to reject assumptions and to approach people, situations, and life with an open heart. He would tell her that his decision to help her wasn't about proving a point or seeking validation, it was simply about doing what he believed was right in the moment. He would say that, like everyone, he had his own biases, and it wasn't always easy to set them aside. But the effort, however imperfect, was what mattered. He would also remind her, as he had reminded himself countless times, that real change came from within. Prejudices could be challenged, old beliefs could be unlearned, but it took time, reflection, and a willingness to grow. And it was only by continually choosing kindness, despite the prejudices one might encounter, that true progress could be made. Alex's response would be simple, but heartfelt. He would thank Isabelle for her words, for her vulnerability, and for acknowledging the impact their encounter had on both of their lives. And he would remind her that the journey of self-awareness and change was never easy, but it was always worth it. He didn't need her apology. What mattered to him was that she had learned, and that her willingness to change was proof that transformation was possible for both of them. In the end, Alex knew that kindness, despite prejudice, wasn't about perfection. It was about persistence. And it was through persistence, through continuously choosing to see people as they truly were, that a better, more understanding world could be built. The true moral of Isabelle and Alex's story is a lesson in empathy, the understanding and connection that allows us to see beyond surface-level differences and challenge the biases that shape how we view the world. Empathy is not merely about feeling sorry for others or recognizing their struggles. It's about stepping outside of our own limited perspective, suspending judgment, and genuinely trying to understand someone else's experience, fears, and motivations. It's about creating space for vulnerability and allowing ourselves to be open to seeing things through another's eyes. At the heart of their encounter was a clash of prejudice. Isabelle's assumption that Alex was untrustworthy and unworthy of her respect simply because of his race, and Alex's understanding that this judgment was rooted in a long history of stereotypes and biases. The turning point in their story came when Isabelle was forced to confront her own biases, and when Alex chose to respond not with anger or retaliation but with understanding, patience, and kindness. It was through these acts, Isabelle's acknowledgement of her own limitations and Alex's decision to offer help despite being wronged, that both were able to break down the walls built by assumptions. Empathy, as shown through their interactions, requires effort. It's easy to categorize people, to make snap judgments based on appearance, race, or past experiences. But when we do that, we shut ourselves off from understanding the richness of a person's story. Empathy, on the other hand, forces us to ask deeper questions, to be curious about others' experiences, and to challenge the biases we hold, even when they are uncomfortable. It is about looking beyond the labels and seeing the human being in front of us, not as a stereotype or a threat, but as an individual with their own complexities, their own history, and their own dreams. The story also shows that breaking biases takes time and intention. For Isabelle, the change didn't happen overnight. She didn't instantly become someone who was free of prejudice. Instead, she made the conscious decision to reflect on her actions, question her assumptions, and allow herself to grow. In doing so, she discovered the power of self-awareness and how transformative it could be. She didn't just learn to trust Alex. She learned to trust her ability to change and to move forward with a new mindset. For Alex, the story highlights that empathy isn't just about passively understanding others. It's about actively choosing to respond with compassion in the face of judgment and ignorance. He didn't hold Isabelle's prejudice against her. He chose to help her because he believed in the value of kindness, even when it wasn't reciprocated. His empathy allowed him to see that her behavior was a reflection of a lifetime of unchallenged biases, and instead of retaliating, he chose to offer support, thereby giving her the chance to grow and learn from the experience. The importance of empathy in breaking biases is profound. It teaches us that true change doesn't happen through condemnation or confrontation, but through understanding and patience. It requires us to listen without judgment, to accept that others may not share our views or experiences, and to extend grace in situations where we might be tempted to react negatively. Empathy is the bridge that connects us to one another, helping us navigate the discomfort of confronting our biases and ultimately breaking them down. In the end, the moral is clear. Empathy is the key to breaking biases, fostering understanding, and building a world where people are judged not by the assumptions others make about them, but by the content of their character and the humanity they shared. By practicing empathy, we create space for meaningful connections, for personal growth, and for a more compassionate, just society where everyone is seen and valued for who they truly are. She thought she had the situation under control. But when the unthinkable happened, everything changed. Isabelle was left stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no one to turn to, and the only person who could help her was the last person she wanted to ask. What happens next will change everything. The night they shared was just the beginning. Can forgiveness and trust rebuild what was broken? Watch the full story to find out how a single moment can transform a life. Now it's your turn. Backhand index pointing right, like, comment, and subscribe to follow Isabelle's journey on epic story moments. Backhand index pointing down, let us know your thoughts below. What would you do if you were in her shoes? Do you think empathy can change someone's heart, or is it too late to fix things? Movie cameras, stay tuned for more suspense-filled moments and emotional twists. You don't want to miss what happens next.